Excel comes with a hidden powerful tool you may or may not know about. If you do know about it, you may have tried using it and then got frustrated when it didn't do exactly what you wanted. This tool is the macro recorder. The macro recorder allows you to record certain steps and then play them back again at a later time. The macro recorder can be used to make selections from the ribbon tab and then assign those selections to a button so that you don't have to go through the tab looking for what you want every time you need it. You can just go ahead and attach it to your cat. 3 buttons that I have here are macros that I've recorded that I find very useful. This first one changes the column headers from letters to numbers and back. The second is one that I've recorded to show or hide the sheet tabs along the bottom of the sheet. This third button will take multiple windows and stack them in a horizontal manner. To do this manually, I would have to go to View, Arrange All, Horizontal. Or I can click this one button. To record for yourself this horizontal windows shortcut, what you need to do first is have more than one window open. Then you can start recording your macro. To record a macro, click on the Record Macro button in the lower left corner of your status bar. You need to enter a name for the macro. You can go with the default macro 1, macro 2 that Excel gives you, but then in the future you may not remember what it's for. So first let's give a descriptive name. The name cannot have any spaces or odd characters in it. So we're going to call this one Horizontal Windows. You can apply a shortcut key to the macro, or like me, you can assign a button to it. Let's go ahead and assign a shortcut key. We're going to call it Control W. So we're just going to type in a W here. We're going to choose to store this macro in your personal macro workbook. By storing it in the personal macro workbook, it will be available to all your workbooks that you have open in your Excel. If you need it stored in the specific workbook, then you can click on this drop down and select the workbook that you want it to save in. Again, we're going to choose the personal macro workbook so that's always available. We can type in a brief description. And then we're going to click OK. The minute we click OK, Excel is going to start recording our actions. So think about what you want to do. We're going to go to the View, Arrange All, and Horizontal. Go to Arrange All, Horizontal, it's already selected in this case, and click OK. The button down here you notice has changed. We're going to stop recording. Congratulations, you recorded a macro. Since we went ahead and assigned it to a shortcut key, we can do it by going Control W. And right away we have our horizontal windows. To access the Developer tab as shown here, you will need to right-click in the ribbon area, select Customize the ribbon, and then click the Developer checkbox and click OK. To view the macros that you recorded, go to the Developer tab and click Visual Basic. You can also use the keyboard shortcut of Alt F11. When you get into the Visual Basic editor, on the left you should see the Project Explorer. If you do not see the Project Explorer, then go to View, Project Explorer. In this case, you're seeing 2 projects in my Project Explorer. The Personal Workbook, which has macros that I've recorded in Excel and are available to all workbooks, and then the Training Data Workbook that I have opened with sample data. To navigate through the Project Explorer is much like navigating through the File Explorer in Windows, except to get your code to show up in here on the right side, which is your code pane, you need to double-click on these modules. Each one of these items is considered a module. As you can see, nothing happens in the code pane on the right when I simply single-click on a module. But if I double-click on a module, you get a blank code pane because I have no code in this module. This module does have code. I've clicked on it once, you don't see anything. I double click on it and you see the macros that I have recorded. Every month you receive the workbook in front of you, and every time you receive it you have to go through and reformat the date columns. As you can see, they're reformatted as day, month, year, and you would rather have them in month, day, year. It doesn't take you very long to do it manually, but wouldn't it be nice to have a keyboard shortcut that you could press that would do each column individually right away? When you're recording a macro, you need to think through the steps that you're going to make, because Excel will record exactly what you do. So if my recording includes my selecting the cell, then every time I run the macro, Excel will select cell D2, which means if I want to also format this column and this column with the same macro, it's not going to work. So before you start recording, think about what you want to do. In this case, we want to be able to select the entire column and then format it. We want Excel to format the selected column, but we don't want Excel necessarily selecting the column for us. So what we need our macro to do is select the entire column and reformat the date. So let's select the cell at the top of our column. We know we don't want Excel recording that. Let's start recording. We're going to enter the name, reformat, date. We're going to assign it to a shortcut key of Control-Shift-D. To get the shift in here, simply press Shift on your keyboard and then the D, and Excel will add the Shift D. We're going to store it in our personal macro workbook. And a brief description. Let's start recording. So we're going to go down, select this data, and then we're going to go to short date. And we're done. We click stop. So let's go here and we'll go Control-Shift-D, and it didn't work. It went back to the first column that I recorded. And this is the frustration that many first-time recorders run into. So what's going on? Let's take a look at our code. As you can see, when I recorded the macro, I selected an exact range, and Excel recorded that. As you can see, it's an A1 reference. So Excel is always going to select this specific range and then apply the number format. That's not what we want. So, failure, macro recorder is useless. No, it's not. You just have to know how to use it. Let's go ahead and delete this macro. Just go ahead and select from sub to end sub, hit delete on your keyboard, and then you can close the Visual Basic Editor. The mistake that I made with the previous macro is I selected a specific range. Using my mouse, I went ahead and selected a range. Excel recorded those exact steps. We don't want it to. We want it to record the steps, but not the exact address. So how do you do that? If you look on the Developer tab, there's a button called Use Relative References. Much like formulas, A1 is an absolute reference. It's always exactly A1. But if you're using relative references, then it's based on the location of the cell that you are currently on. So in this case, we need to use relative referencing when recording this macro. So click Use Relative Referencing to turn it on. Now let's record our macro again. First, you definitely want to start with where you want the column to be selected. Because if I'm here and then I record moving to over here, Excel will always do that when it runs. Let's record our macro. Now, what I'm going to do is use a keyboard shortcut to navigate down to the bottom of the column. For those who don't know, it's Control, Shift, and down arrow. If you press all those buttons on your keyboard at the same time, Excel will automatically highlight to the bottom of the column. I then apply my desired format and I hit stop. So did it work this time? Let's select the next column and go Control Shift D, and it worked. And then Control Shift D, and it worked. Well, that's great, and it works with a small bit of data. What if I have a larger array of data? Remember when we looked at the macro earlier, it was exactly D2 to D18. It stopped at row 18. Is that going to happen again? Let's find out. Control Shift D, and it selected the entire column. Why? Because instead of using my mouse to select a specific range and stopping on D18, I used the keyboard shortcut of Control Shift down arrow. You should use the keyboard shortcuts for navigating around your Excel sheet as much as possible because it's not a specific instruction. By using the navigation keys to navigate around a sheet, you don't give Excel a specific address to go to. You're giving it an instruction to jump to the end of a row or to the end of a column. Let's record adding the sum of a column at the bottom of the column. So we already know how to do this, right? To navigate quickly to the bottom of a column, we start at the top, and then we just do a Control down arrow. You don't want to shift at this time because we're not selecting, we're just jumping down. And then we need to go down one more cell. And then we click the Auto Sum button. It puts in the formula for us. Hit Enter, and we're done recording, and we can stop. Simple, right? Okay, let's see. Did it really work? Let's test our macro on a larger data sample. So we place our cursor at the top of the column, and let's run our macro. And it didn't work. Look at that, it overwrote my data. It stopped exactly where it did in the macro that I recorded. Oh, I know why. I didn't have relative referencing on, right? Okay, so let's try this again, and this time I've got to make sure my relative referencing is on. See, relative referencing will stay on during a session of Excel with that workbook open, but the minute you close the workbook, it turns itself off. So always make sure that the relative reference option is turned on or off as you need it before you start recording. So let's try this again. Let's go here and we'll delete that. We're going to turn on relative referencing. We'll select our first cell and start recording. Now remember, I already have a macro called invoice total. So, and I can't have the same macro name twice. I need to rename it something else. We'll go invoice total 2. Same time, I can't use the same shortcut key more than once. This time, let's not use a shortcut key. I'll show you another way to run a macro. Alright, so this time our relative referencing is on. Let's see if we can get it right. Control down arrow, go down one, and we put in the sum. Hit Enter. Okay. Now we stop. Let's see if it'll work this time. We'll go to another data set. Select the first cell in the column. You can select this one too, by the way. I always just happen to select under the header. And to run this macro, we're going to go to View, macros, view macros, and we called this one invoice total 2, and click run. It went to the bottom, but that's a really small number, isn't it? Well, look at that formula. It's not looking at the entire column. So what did we do wrong this time? We didn't really do anything wrong when we were using the sum button. It's just that the Excel macro recorder doesn't like us using the button. We can actually still add the sum of a column to the bottom of that column, but we have to do it a little bit more manually. So let's try this again. Again, we are going to go ahead and select the first cell in the column. We're going to start the macro recorder. Okay, we're going to go through the steps that we have so far. Control, down arrow, and down one more to go to the bottom of the column. Now this time we're going to type in the sum formula. We're going to do it with a little twist. So equal sign to start typing a formula, sum, left parentheses, B, $2, which means that we're doing a partial absolute reference. We're tying in that row, colon, and then the last cell in that column we want to include is B18. So go ahead and type B18 and then your closing parentheses and hit enter. Stop the recorder. Now let's go to our data set. First cell. And we're going to play that macro. What do you think is going to happen? That's a much larger sum than last time. And look at it. It includes the entire column. Why did it work? Because this time we tied in the first cell. We made that absolute for the column. But then we told Excel to go ahead and make this relative. If you take a look at the code, Alt F11 to bring up the Visual Basic Editor, you can see down here, these are the past examples that we did. This was the first one where the relative reference was not turned on. And you can see it hard-coded the B19 and the B20. In this one, relative referencing was turned on. So based on my selection of the first cell at the top of the column, it put in the formula. But you'll notice that it's absolute. In this case, again, relative referencing was still turned on, but when we typed in the formula, we were able to make it partial absolute and partial relative referencing. And this gave the macro recorder the needed flexibility so that it can add the column for any set of data.